Okay, so in our last two slides for this chapter, we'll compare and contrast Hinduism and Buddhism. And the first comparison that we'll make is that both Hinduism and Buddhism have experienced transformations. And this is primarily geographically speaking. Hinduism spread across the Indian subcontinent. Remember, it began with that mixture of Aryan immigrants and the indigenous peoples in the Indus Valley, and then spread to the subcontinent, where it is still the primary religion. And Buddhism spread from Buddha's home in the Himalayan foothills throughout India, where it mostly died out. And then it spread to the east and then Southeast Asia, where it flourishes. So both have experienced geographical transformations. Both religions also have their own sacred calendars, and these calendars mark events that control their life cycles. And we talked about the fact that Hindu priests officiated many Buddhist ceremonies, and in part that's why Buddhism died out in India. Outside of India, where no other major religion existed, Buddhist priests performed their own ceremonies, which allowed them to spread outside of India. Both religions also have their own sacred language. Hindu priests spoke Sanskrit, and because the Buddhists felt like Sanskrit was limited primarily to Hindus, they spoke a native language, Pali. And so they both had a sacred language, even though those languages were different. And so within these religions, because of the use of language, they had extensive literatures, philosophy, poetry, folk tales, drama, and both even had their own artistic traditions in sculpture and temple architecture and paintings. Another thing that Hinduism and Buddhism had in common was that they were usually able to connect with the common people. In places that Theravada Buddhism was practiced, where the religion was restricted to monks and nuns, people felt more drawn to Hinduism. They felt like it was more applicable to their common average lives. And even though Theravada Buddhism was restricted and did not make room for commoners, Mahayana Buddhism did. And so with Mahayana Buddhism, with its multitude of gods and bodhisattvas who helped people reach enlightenment and their heavens, people felt more connected to Mahayana Buddhism. So to some extent, both religions were able to reach commoners. Another important similarity between Hinduism and Buddhism is that both reveal the flexibility of their religions. In order to be a world religion where you're reaching different kinds of people, you have to be flexible. And this was true of both Hinduism and Buddhism. And it seems like every area they reached to, they allowed for local customs and made concessions for the various languages and regions and classes of people. And so both of these world religions were able to expand their practices and their theology to incorporate more members, and that probably is why they have lasted for so long. And lastly, with comparing Hinduism and Buddhism, there are ties between the government and religion, and that's been true historically for almost everywhere. When we talked about India in the last chapter, we talked about how Ashoka turned to Buddhism and as a result brought Buddhism to India and was able to maintain a period of peace. And that was true with Hinduism as well, as kings in India had agreements with Brahmin priests in order to have their support. And it's true, the reverse is true, that when governments turn against religious groups that are really popular, it can be really devastating for them. And so this is our really short contrasting slide for Hinduism and Buddhism. And there's really just one contrasting point that I want to bring out, and that is that Hinduism was a polytheistic religion, had many, many gods, and worked to provide cultural unity for South Asia, particularly India. Remember, the Indian subcontinent today is still primarily Hindu. Buddhism, on the other hand, doesn't really provide unity for anyone because it was a religion of millions of people. And so this is really the major difference, is that India experienced cultural unity because of Hinduism, and Buddhism really didn't bring unity to any government because it was practiced by so many ethnically different people. And that is where we'll end. I hope you guys have an awesome night.